What are some of the games that professional company buyers, the private equity groups that are doing roll-ups or other things?
Don't talk to anybody about an unsolicited offer until you get an NDA in place, because that gives you some legal protections against
Their effective price went down by several $1 million, and that's painful.
You want to understand that every deal has a buyer and a seller, and as the seller or the buyer, it's always negotiable.
Maui Mastermind presents the Business Coach Podcast, answering your questions and providing real actionable insights for building a better, stronger, more profitable business without sacrificing your time, life, or freedom anymore.
Hi, welcome to the Business Coach. I'm your host, David Finkel, and today I'm joined back again by my good friend, business coach Rich Wood. Now, Rich is someone who's been a serial entrepreneur himself. He's been an equity player in some fairly large, successful businesses. He's done buying and selling of things. And as we look at today, this is the second part of selling your company. Now, in the first episode of this two-part sequence, Rich and I went into the strategic considerations for how to get top dollar for your company. If you haven't listened or watched that one, please make sure you go listen and watch that one first. You'll get more from it. But at the very least here in this episode, where there was so much we were talking about that I didn't want to cut it short. So to keep it really detailed, we actually went into things in this episode, part 2, like what are some of the deal point considerations and what does an earnout look like and how much you want to collateralize or protect yourself in that earnout, or what are the non-compete provisions that you want to have, and what's a non-compete duration that you should argue for and what shouldn't you give for it, and what are some of the games that professional company buyers, the private equity groups that are doing roll-ups or other things, what are some of the games that they play that you need to be on the lookout for and protect yourself from? So this is Rich and I. I think you're going to really enjoy this episode of The Business Coach. And with that, no further ado, let's jump into the episode. Well, welcome back, Rich. Thank you for joining me here today.
Absolutely, David. Thanks very much. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, so this is part 2 of an earlier conversation. We started off in the last episode. We started off talking about the sale of a company. We started going in about those ways of what are the 4 types of sale processes, what are the 3 types of buyers in part 1. We got into the strategic side quite in depth, ways to increase your valuation by building that selling narrative, that story, and
Right.
how do we make sure our financials are set the right way and looking at our concentration risks, et cetera. I want to come in this episode in part 2 of this conversation risk about some of the deal points and the contractual parts with that. So I want to start off with this. So I'm selling a company. Oftentimes it happens where I get this unsolicited letter or email now in today's world that says, hey, David, you built a great company. I'm really impressed. I'm interested in buying it. Here enclosed is my letter of intent, or, hey, here's my offer to purchase your company. And it's a non-binding offer there. What's it, number one, feel like to get a non-binding offer of this part? And that oftentimes is at an inflated price. And then number 2, what does it mean to get a non-binding offer?
So a non-binding offer obviously is that there's no commitment being made by the buyer in doing anything about actually buying the business. Typically, non-binding offers are fishing expeditions where competitors are looking to see where you might be, or they're fishing expeditions where somebody's looking to see what strengths you might have or what your financials look like. And naive sellers will tend to be too open with their books or too open with what's going on. And I would say never enter into anything without a non-disclosure agreement being signed before you do anything. So get the NDA signed. Non-binding agreements aren't worth the paper they're written on. And I could just tell you so many stories, but the obvious thing for the seller is they get excited because somebody's interested enough in their business to want to buy it. And it jacks you up.
Right. And that jacking you up, that kind of excitement from this is what I see is the seller feels really proud. I mean, it's like the analogy I share is I go buy someone's home, and it's the home that they built themselves.
Right.
And they're so proud to show me every facet. David, we chose these handles over here. David, rather than doing 2x4s, we did 2x6s. So there's an extra 2 inches of insulation all the way through. And here's what that does. And I watch clients being tempted to tell their magic sauce, their magic formula, without having any protections contractually or without having vetted the person on the other side. So here's something I'll just put out there. And you directly hit this, Rich, which is a lot of buyers that are out there are doing this because they're giving an inflated offer, which makes somebody feel really excited. And they may or may not be a viable buyer. And the best way to handle that is, if I'm interested, is to interview them and do some due diligence on them early on. Well, I might be open to selling the company. It's not something I'd really considered. We have a great growth track record and others. But before I do any of that, I need to find out more about who you are. Clearly, you know who I am because you offered us $18 million for the business. So clearly, you've had some thinking with us. Tell me more about you. Who are your customers? Have you bought anybody else recently? Who did you buy? I should ask those questions with that part. Later, I want to convert my one-to-one relationship into a one-to-many, where I'm putting my company out for competitive offers so I see what else is there. But before I share it, then the second comment, Rich, I just would make is this idea of I don't disclose information all at once. It's a series of information. At first, I might just take off my jacket. And later, I might unbutton one of the buttons on my shirt. I'm not going to take off my shirt, let alone stuff below the waist, until we've actually had some real-time history due diligence go on both ways. I'm not going to share my customer list. They're not going to know any of my revenues or my margins until after they progressively have produced on their side that they're a viable candidate to purchase the company. And I've done other steps. Comment from you on that.
Well, so I go back to this concept that a lot of people that put out unsolicited offers that it's a fishing expedition, and it's typically a competitor that's on that fishing expedition. The other point that comes to mind is, regardless of the offer, regardless of the number, don't be so eager to sell because you can improve your negotiating position by just holding them off at arm's length for a while until you figure it out. The third thing is, and I'll say this again, don't talk to anybody about an unsolicited offer until you get an NDA in place, because that gives you some legal protections against any information that might be shared between the potential buyer and the seller.
And for heaven's sakes, don't just sign their LOI. David, it has a clause that says non-solicitation provision right there. And it even has a clause that says non-solicitation, right? In this confidentiality provision. And I laugh. I say, did you notice what it is? You can't talk to anyone. Nothing stops them from talking to anyone they want. So I will commonly tell a client, you need your attorney to write up a good non-disclosure agreement that also has non-solicitation, which says that not only can they not disclose, but they're not going to try to solicit to hire your employees. They're not going to try to solicit your customers, your vendors, your suppliers. You need to protect yourself from that. And if they're a real true buyer, they'd be willing to do that. Absolutely. There might be some things to negotiate through on that, but you shouldn't have an issue with that.
No, and it is the beginning of the dance, right? And first off, as a seller, you need to decide whether or not you want to go out on the dance floor. And if you want to go out on the dance floor, there's all of these other things that you need to do to protect yourself and your employees. And there's so many other things that you can do to maximize the outcome for you and your employees.
Yeah, a couple other contractual games. We'll jump into that. So here's one contractual game I watch buyers use, and they try to use it against clients. Now, if I'm involved or you're involved or one of the other Maui coaches involved, we've seen it enough that we can say something saying, hey, red flag, talk with your M&A attorney about how to change this language. But they'll have a clause in there, for example, that talks about a working capital offset, wherein they'll say that, every business needs a certain amount of working capital. So some of what you have in the bank account is your working capital. And at closing, they're going to settle up that working capital is going to transfer over to them by reducing the purchase, effectively reducing the purchase price. And yet this happens and hurts a lot of people I know, because as a business owner, I built this company. Let's say it's a $40 million a year revenue company. I might leave several $1 million in the checking account because I'm not really managing it that closely. My buyer is going to argue that's working capital. You're going to argue that no, based on my collection cycle and my cash flow cycle, that's not working capital. That's just extra money that's been sitting there. And now I've got to wrangle back. And many times the purchase contract is actually in the buyer's favor on that very thing. Their effective price went down by several $1,000,000, and that's painful.
Yeah, and you can do things, you can do a lot proactively on the chart of accounts side and with your balance sheet to set yourself up so you're disciplining yourself the right way to handle your financials and your balance sheet, so you don't have to go down the path of recreating or creating something anew that's never been there. The other part of it is that I think it's important to regularly get your financials. If you're thinking about selling, regularly get your financials reviewed, which is a different level of review than an audit. But I think it's important to fundamentally ensure that your financials are solid and strong. And an auditor or a reviewer can help you set things up proactively 2 years ahead of time.
Let's stay with that for a moment. So with my financials, there are three main levels of way I can do it. One is just an owner prepared financials that have not had anything from a third party looking at. The second is a reviewed financials. And at the highest level is an audited financials. Give us the difference between audited financials and reviewed financials. Clearly, the company prepared financials that no third party has seen is obvious. That's clear. What's the difference between reviewed versus audited? And why did you say reviewed versus audited? And I know there was a reason for it.
Yeah, so the reason is the seller side. Audited financials are quite a bit more expensive than reviewed financials. And the reason that they're a lot more expensive is that an audited set of financials will send in a team of people. They not only will look at your books, they will not only vet your books and cross-check the numbers to make sure the accounts were all set up correctly and reconciling correctly. They will make sure that the processes and procedures that you have set up inside of your accounting team are allowing you to duplicate numbers that you can believe in. Whereas a reviewed set of financials, they don't go to the level of detail where they're auditing process and procedure and whether or not you're GAAP compliant and all of that. The reviewed financials do it at a much higher level to make sure the numbers are correct.
Yeah, and the cost difference is quite a bit because of that. They're not going to look at audited financials. They're going to look at actual primary source material. They're like the historian who's going to check the newspaper from 1870 to get the quote right versus the textbook, where the reviewed aren't going to necessarily do that. Yeah.
One other thing, David, though, that's worthwhile for people to know is that if you have audited versus reviewed financials, that does make you look different to a potential buyer. So a buyer is going to be much more trustworthy of the numbers and therefore come in with a higher offer if your books have been reviewed, and even more so if they've been audited, because now they know that they can trust the numbers, and the due diligence process that they go through will be a little bit easier on you.
That's right. That's a good point with that. You know, one of the things I see that I was having a conversation with Kevin Bassett, who is CPA and runs a firm, and a lot of our coaching clients are clients of his CPA firm. And Kevin's become a dear friend over the last, 20 years. He's been an advisor at various events. He's been at keynote speaker, but he's helped over 100 companies that he's helped sell that are clients of his to private equity buyers, which I thought was pretty cool as a benchmark. And one of the comments he shared with me, Rich, is this idea we called it pushdown accounting, wherein in a clause that private equity buyers build in, that they say that they're going to allow for pushdown accounting, such that an owner might not know what that means. But what it later on means is, hey, we're going to take your company and bring it into the fold. Expenses at our corporate level are going to get pushed down to the level of the business unit, reducing the business unit's profit, which now might save the private equity buyer hundreds of thousands or even several millions of dollars on the earnout, because it affects the formulation for the earnout amounts. And so I just need to be aware of that. And a lot of buyers that I see that are from the private equity will do that, but a lot of the companies selling, for every private equity buyer, they might buy 20, 50, 100 companies in their career. Most sellers will only sell a company once, twice, or 3 times. So a disadvantage. This is something that is a game that private equity buyers play that we as sellers of companies should be aware of, and we should at least knowingly know it's there so we can push back on that if we think so. Otherwise, you're going to find a rude awakening 6 months, 12 months later when you get that first earnout payment and you're expecting $1 million, and now it's only $750,000. Wait, where's my other $250,000? Well, the numbers were less than you suggested. What do you mean? Look, right here, it's a no. we had to put these expenses from corporate through, they had to pay this expense for this and this expense for that. And it got pushed down pro rata across all these owned business units. And it just is a rude awakening.
Yeah. So as a buyer of a business, there's certain tactics that you can use. And as the seller of a business, there are certain things that you can do to avoid those kinds of tactics. The best thing you can do as a seller or a buyer, even if it's an M&A firm or, a PE firm, you can hire a lawyer and an M&A attorney that knows these tricks and knows how to play against the PE firm that's trying to play them if you're on the sell side. So there are things you can do to mitigate a lot of those issues.
Yeah. And so when you look at the earnout part, there's going to be a formula that says how you're going to calculate that earnout. And I need to be comfortable with that. That's one to talk with your advisor, who hopefully she or he has seen this many, many times. But the other one is the security on the earnout. Like, what's your collateral for the money that they still have to pay you over time? One of our clients that we have in the Maui community is in the process right now. He's in the final probably 60 days of selling his company. It took him probably close to, I think it's like 18 years when he first started it ago. He's about to sell it. He's going to take roughly half the money is going to be paid out over time. And if he does this, my comment to him is, well, how are you securing that? Is it a personal guarantee? Is it secured with a UCC1 filing against all the personal assets, which is the business assets, its receivables, its customer list, et cetera? I'm curious for you, any comment on this idea of protecting you in an earnout situation, which is very common in today's world, that there will be a portion that's paid out post-closing?
Yeah, so on the sell side, protecting yourself on an earnout is to make sure that you can meet the revenue targets with reasonable levels of confidence. And then you've got on the upside those earnouts protected with some security side. And if you can incorporate some escalation of the number based on inflation, if you will, with that number. So if you're going to pay me out $100,000 over the next 3 years, then I want some appreciation of that $100,000 on an annual basis. So it's all part of how you structure the deal. But I would say make sure that you know that you can meet the earnout targets with confidence before you enter into an earnout deal.
Yeah. This particular client, there was something else that was interesting in it. There had in there, the buyer was smart. He actually put a clause in that said that if the seller wants to, I can cash out this earnout amount for it was like a 30% reduction in terms of what was owed on that other payment, which I talked with our client. I said, well, first of all, if you do this the right way, you're going to get half your money up front. You're owed a fairly significant amount of money afterwards. To take a 30% discount on that relative to the risk involved, if you can better secure yourself so that if they default, that you can take the business back, and you don't think they can harm the business enough to offset the 30% discount, you're financially better off to wait what I think it was like 24 months, if memory serves me, before you get fully paid off for that earnout. You're better off that way. And if it turns out that they're in default and you're managing it closely, you can send your default letter. They're going to have 15 days to cure the default. If they don't, I would go back in there. This is a big earnout, right, from this particular type of business. I said I would want the right that if, in fact, they default on it and they don't cure the default within a reasonable period of time, 15 days, 30 days, it should trigger some other escalation that gives you either more control or maybe even the option to take back or repossess the collateral. There might be a case where if they default after 60 or 90 days, what if you got the whole business back? Yes, it might have taken a 10, 20, 30% ding in value, but you've already received half the money up front. You could build it back up and sell it again. And that's just a new way of thinking about it, Rich.
And I think that's a great way to think about it, but there's also that emotional component that a lot of people have a hard time valuing or factoring in. And the idea, and most of the business owners that I've worked with on the sell side, they get to a point where they decide that they're going to sell their company. They make the deal, they cut the deal, they close the deal. If there's an earnout and there's some issue that goes on with how things are being handled, most business owners don't want the business back once they've sold it. So there's that emotional component that people have to wrestle with as they go into that more sophisticated way of thinking about how to cut a deal.
You know, as you say that, I know this is true. Private equity buyers are most notorious, but other buyers do the same thing. They stretch out the sale process intentionally to create deal fatigue. They make the due diligence process more onerous than it needs to be, so that in the last, 10% of the timeline is when they get some of the juiciest concessions from their seller because they've tired them, they've got them emotionally hooked in there. And you think that this would be, accidental. It's not. It's an intentional thing that they do. It's part of their playbook that we can be aware of. Rich, I want to talk about one more thing before we come to an end here today. I want to talk about non-competes. So, first of all, what is a non-compete briefly? And then we'll talk about what are common types of non-competes you'll see in a buy-sell of a company when you're selling it.
So a non-compete it's this simple. I am agreeing not to compete with the services. If I sell my business, I'm not going to start up a new business and compete against you with the clients that you've just absorbed with the same business doing the same thing. So a non-compete says I'm not going to go into the same business and compete against your business that I just sold you.
And I'll tell you from a practical standpoint to any of our audience out there, many people who I've worked with have sold their company thinking that they would never do the same business again. But they find themselves 3, 4, 5, 6 years later, after trying a few other businesses in the interim, going back to redo the business that they sold once upon a time before. And I would tell you, it might be as many as a quarter to half of the people who don't fully retire, that do start other businesses, end up coming back to the business that they did before. So in my world, I know this means that when I counsel a coaching client who's selling, number one, how can we narrowly constrict the non-compete clause? Number two, the duration matters. There's a big difference between a 36-month non-compete and a 5-year non-compete. It's not just 2 years. It's a big deal. So if the price is low, I shouldn't have a non-compete. If they're buying my business for a 1 or 2 times multiple of revenue, a profit, there shouldn't be a non-compete. They're not paying enough to keep me out of the game. But if they're paying a reasonable number, almost always a 36-month non-compete is probably all you need to do on that part. You should fight on that. I can't tell you the number of people who are clients that at the 3-4 year mark would love to start the same business again, but they can't for another 2 years. And what happens is their skill set, their contacts, their energy level has dropped somewhat, become deprecated, and they lose an opportunity. So most buyers, they're going to want it. They're going to want 5 years, but it's a deal point. You should be able to negotiate that back in most cases to 3 years. Rarely will you get less than 3 years on a major sale.
Right. So I want to emphasize a point that you just made. So most non-competes are negotiable. The buyer is going to want it to be as broad and as long as they can possibly make it. On the sell side, you can make it fairly short in duration and you can narrow the scope. And that's something that you want to think about if you're entering into a non-compete. Keep it short and keep it as narrow as you can. That gives you as much flexibility to do something should you want to 2 or 3 years out.
Yeah. Rich, I want to ask one last question here today. If you had any one last piece of advice, some actionable idea that came out of today that you would want them to keep front and center, one of our audience, what would that be to that business owner? And then I'll share after you've shared. So go ahead and start us off. What would one be?
I think that the one takeaway that I would want people to leave with is that you want to understand that every deal has a buyer and a seller. And as the seller or the buyer, it's always negotiable. And you don't want to be overly excited about any deal you get. Everything can have an upside if you're on the seller side. So don't think that you just have to give something away because what you've created has a lot of value.
I love that. I love that. I put down for me, be prepared that your buyers are going to play certain games, especially for those people who are repeat buyers. Not just if a supplier of yours has bought 2 companies over the last 4 years and they're buying you, they're less likely to be playing games. If you're selling to a company that has bought 73 other companies to do this roll up, they're playing games. They're playing games with pushdown accounting. They're playing games with hiring you out with deal fatigue. They're playing games with asking for an onerous non-compete. They are playing games in there. which means you've got to lean heavily on your business coach, lean heavily on your sell-side advisor, lean heavily on your M&A attorney, your CPA, to look at what are these games that are likely being played to protect yourself
Absolutely.
going in there.
That's a really good one. Yeah.
Well, Rich, thank you for joining us for another episode of The Business Coach. I really appreciate you being here.
David, I always enjoy our conversations, and I'm happy to come back anytime you want.
All right. To the audience, I want to say thank you for joining us for another episode. I look forward in future to getting deeper into the subject of what's it like to actually sell a company. Maybe we'll do that as a future episode. As always, we'd love to get your questions or comments posted here. And if you've got a good friend of yours that doesn't know about the podcast, please let him or her know about it. Share the wealth so that they can also be learning from the business coach. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, David.